again, thank you for the opportunity to present. So I'll tell you a little bit about what we do at our lab. So I'm based at the Children's Hospital in Ottawa, and we do a lot of de-identification work. We work with a number of healthcare providers, with the hospitals, and registries, provincial registries, national registries, and help them figure out ways, defensible ways, to disclose data for secondary purposes, including research purposes, public health purposes. We also do a lot of work in the U.S. with public sector, private sector entities, again on de-identification. Because of that, we're very, very concerned about any claims that de-identification may not work, or that there are any weaknesses in the methods that are being used to de-identify data, which brings us to the topic of today. Not sure if this will work. Okay. So in the last few years, there have been some articles published implying that the methods for de-identification do not work very well. So initially, we didn't pay much attention to that, but then policymakers started paying attention to it, in particular in the U.S., and there was some movement by policymakers in adopting some of these views. So we decided to look at the evidence and do a systematic analysis of the evidence on de-identification, re-identification attacks, and see what the evidence says about the ability to re-identify health data. So what I will talk about today is go through the evidence and explain to you go through various re-identification attacks and explain to you why, what you can learn from these re-identification attacks. And then at the end, I'll close up by discussing just at a high level the de-identification methods and processes that can be used that are defensible. So the key points then will be there's really no evidence or weak evidence that re-identification is easy to do. All the re-identification attacks that are known were not done on de-identified data, and I'll explain to you that in a moment. There are powerful de-identification techniques that can provide strong guarantees for releasing data. Any data set that has been de-identified properly, there's no evidence that it can be successfully attacked, at least no public evidence so far. So as far as we know, if you de-identify data properly, it's very difficult, very challenging to re-identify individuals from that. And I think that we have a poor de-identification problem in the sense that a lot of data is released that's not de-identified properly. And this is really the main issue we're dealing with, is that if people are releasing data that's not de-identified properly, then it makes it easy to determine the identity of the individuals in those data sets. And that is a real problem. Okay. So I'll start then with the broad claims that have been made, which is essentially around the science of de-identification. So an article was published a few years ago talking about the easy re-identification result, or easy re-identification hypothesis, basically claiming that it's very easy to re-identify data sets, and therefore you essentially shouldn't bother de-identifying data. And of course, that's a very alarming statement. And it was done, this was an analysis done by a lawyer, and it received a lot of attention within the legal community. And there are really three implications of that statement, this easy re-identification hypothesis. Three alarming and very important implications that one needs to understand. If de-identification does not work, then you have to start obtaining consent from all the patients to use their data for secondary purposes. And there are a number of problems with that. One, of course, are the practical problems. For large databases, obtaining consent from a large number of people may not be practical. Finding them, communicating with them may not be advisable if their interaction with the health system was traumatic. But also we know that consenters and non-consenters tend to differ on important characteristics. So people or patients who consent to have their data used for secondary purposes or consent to participate in any kind of study tend to be different from those who don't consent. And the evidence for that is overwhelming. There's a lot of evidence has been accumulated for observational studies, for clinical trials, showing that consenters and non-consenters differ on at least 12 different characteristics, on their age, their sex, their socioeconomic status, their education, where they live, urban versus rural, and so on. So essentially you end up with a biased sample if you were to go out and obtain consent. It doesn't mean you shouldn't do it, of course, we do that all the time, but it just means that if that becomes the only way to get access to data, then there'll be more chances of these biases creeping in. The other implication of that statement is it discourages de-identification. So if it's true that the identification doesn't work, then why bother? Which means more identifiable information will be disclosed, will be shared, which actually increases the risk to privacy, because now you're going to have more identifiable information more broadly available, and the likelihood of reportable breaches also increases. Reportable breaches are reportable only if the information is identifiable. If it's de-identified, it wouldn't be reportable. And if health information custodians or data custodians don't de-identify because they believe it's not effective, then there'll be more chances of these breaches occurring. So all of these are terrible consequences or undesirable consequences. So this is really an important issue, whether de-identification works or not. And I'll go through 5 examples that people often use to argue that re-identification is easy. So the first example is Governor Weld of Massachusetts. And this is an old example, probably one of the first ones. So in that particular case, the Group Insurance Commission, which insures state employees in Massachusetts, was releasing insurance claims data for the state employees and making that data available, publicly available or available for a small fee, or selling the data. So an enterprising researcher took that GIC data and matched it with the voter registration records for Cambridge, Massachusetts, which is where the governor lives, and was able to re-identify the governor's health insurance claims, which includes diagnosis information. So that's one often cited re-identification attack. This is the Weld example. The second example is AOL. And again, this is an often cited example. And here, AOL, or a researcher at AOL, released a large database of search queries of AOL customers and posted it on the web. And the idea there was to make data available for the research community to do more research on search queries and analyzing search queries, etc. Within a couple of, and so they removed the names of the users, and it was 630,000 odd users in that data set. So they removed the names of the users and created these persistent pseudonyms, so you can track user queries or users over multiple search queries. And soon afterwards, a number of New York Times reporters were able to figure out that one of the users was Thelma Arnold from her search queries. And they had a New York Times story about her, and you can see they took her picture with her dog, and they said, this is terrible, AOL released personal information online. And of course, soon afterwards, the data was taken off AOL's website, but the data is still available. If you want a copy, if you search for it, you'll find it. Many copies of it available online with some nice tools to allow you to search through that data set. The other example is occurred in Illinois, and it was concerning a neuroblastoma registry, which is a rare childhood cancer. And in this case, the Southern Illinoisian, which is a newspaper, wanted to get the cancer registry from the public health department. And the public health department refused, said this is personal information. So they went to court all the way up to the Supreme Court of the state. And as part of the court case, the public health department brought in an expert witness who was apparently able to re-identify a very large percentage of the children in that database. So this is another example of, look, a data set that was, a cancer registry data set was re-identified. Another example, which is again often cited, is Netflix. So in that case, Netflix posted data on a large number of its customers' movie ratings online, and they had a $1 million competition to for analysts to build data mining models for a recommendation system that beats Netflix's current recommendation system. So when you go to Netflix, when you watch a movie, it tells you other people like you also liked that movie. So the competition ran, and the best model was developed by a group of statisticians, and they got their $1 million. But as part of the competition, a number of researchers took the Netflix data, and they claimed that they were able to re-identify some of the individuals in that data set by matching their movie ratings to in the Netflix data with the IMDb database, which is another public movie rating database. And of course, there was a big kerfuffle around that, and Netflix was planning to organize a second competition, but the second competition was canceled because of the bad publicity around this attack. And of course, people started suing them because they claimed that Netflix posted their personal information online. And then the last example is a Canadian one. So this was the CBC made an access request to get the adverse drug event database from Health Canada, and it is claimed, based on court documents, that the CBC then identified a 26-year-old girl who had died while taking an acne drug from the adverse drug event database. And using the information in the database, they narrowed it down, and matching it with the public obituaries, they narrowed it down to 4 families. They contacted the 4 families until they found the correct one, and then they did a story on this acne drug, arguing that it's causing all these serious adverse events. And eventually Health Canada pulled the drug off the market when they did their own analysis, and when the CBC went back for more data, Health Canada said no. So they went to court, and as part of that, the Health Canada witnesses made the claim that the CBC launched a re-identification attack on the database, and therefore they should not be given as much information now compared to what they got in the past. So these examples are cited as reasons why data sets cannot be safely de-identified. Okay, so then we wanted to examine the evidence around this to determine whether this is true, it's easy to re-identify data or not. And we did a systematic review of the literature. We looked at publicly available or publicly known re-identification attacks, all of them, basically. Try to get as many as were known. And our focus was on health data. Okay. Sure why this is not working. Okay, so this is the article that was published. It was published at the end of last year, and if you just Google the title, you'll get to it. And that article describes the full analysis that was done. Now, a systematic review is a standard method that's used to summarize the evidence on a particular topic. It's a standard methodology, it's a standard approach, it's used certainly in medicine very extensively, and it's well known that single studies are unreliable, and therefore you use a systematic review and a meta-analysis to combine results from multiple studies to draw a much stronger and a much more robust conclusion. So it's not a common practice in computer science or apparently in the legal community, but it's a very standard way to combine evidence and draw conclusions from the totality of evidence that you have about a particular topic. And it addresses issues around publication bias and heterogeneity and so on. I think this is an important point to make, because after we published this study, some computer scientists came and said, systematic reviews are not a valid methodology, which is the most outrageous statement I've heard in a long time. But it is a standard methodology and well documented, been around for decades and so on. So I'll tell you now what we did learn. As part of this, we started off with about 1,500 articles that were potentially relevant, and we went through all those articles and narrowed it down. At the end, we came up with 14 articles that, or 14 publicly known re-identification attacks that we analyzed very carefully. And some key findings from these, and this was until October 2010, that only 10 of the 14 actually described how the re-identification attack was done. So the CBC example, for instance, it was a statement in a court document, so we don't actually know how the re-identification was done. Only 6 out of the 14 were on health data. So only 6 known re-identification attacks successful re-identification attacks on health data. 11 of the 14 were done by researchers. So actually researchers are the most dangerous people when it comes to re-identification attacks. And the remainder were done by the media. So researchers on the media are the ones who tend to do the most re-identification attacks. And for the researchers, these are demonstration attacks to demonstrate that it's possible to attack a database, or they have a new technique and they want to test it out or show how it works. But the vast majority were done by researchers. And most of these attacks were done in the US. A couple in Canada and a couple in Europe, but most of them were in the US. And this really, I think, is a reflection of the large community of people working in this space in the US. Only 2 out of the 14 followed what I would describe as defensible methods for de-identifying the data. So in only 2 out of the 14 cases was the data properly de-identified beforehand. And this is really an important point, because if you don't de-identify the data properly, poor de-identification is very common. So 12 out of the 14 were poorly de-identified, and only 2 out of the 14 were properly de-identified data sets. And in those 2 cases, the success rate was very low. So in the healthcare one, only one of them was related to healthcare, to a health data set. This study was sponsored by the Office for the National Coordinator for Health IT in the US, and the success rate was 0.013%, which is a very small success rate. They were able to re-identify 2 out of 15,000 records, which is actually not surprising, because re-identification risk is probabilistic. It's never going to be 0, so you have to decide what's small enough, right? And 0.013% would be, by any measure, considered a very small risk. But that was the only study that was done on a properly defensively de-identified data set, and the success rate was low, and that was exactly as expected. This graph shows you across all 14 what the success rate was. It was about 0.26. 26% of the records in those across these 14 studies were re-identified, which basically shows you that if you de-identify poorly, then it's easy to re-identify individuals in your database. The studies or the attacks on the properly de-identified data are the ones at the bottom left, right, basically. Sorry, bottom left corner, which shows that the hit rate was very small. One of the standards we use to determine whether a data set was properly de-identified is the HIPAA Safe Harbor de-identification standard. So HIPAA in the US has 2 standards for de-identifying data. One is called the Safe Harbor, and the other one is a statistical method. Safe Harbor essentially defines 18 fields or 18 pieces of information that you must remove from your data set to claim that it is a de-identified data set. And these include things like names, zip codes, dates except for year, and then directly identifying pieces of information like telephone numbers, fax numbers, email addresses, biometrics, vehicle identification numbers, and so on. So basically we said, you have to at least meet Safe Harbor to claim that your data set is de-identified. And if you don't even meet Safe Harbor, which I think is a basic minimal standard, if you don't even meet Safe Harbor, then you can't make any plausible defensible claim that your data set is de-identified. So now let's go through the 5 examples that I discussed earlier on. In the case of the Weld example, the Group Insurance Commission was releasing data with full dates of birth and the full zip code. So that data set would not pass safe harbor. It was not a properly de-identified data set. So that's why it was really easy to re-identify individuals. Plus, that attack was done before HIPAA came into effect, so this was pre-HIPAA. The second example with AOL, so it's pretty well known that search queries, a lot of people run vanity search queries, where you enter your name in the search query to see what's known about you. Actually, a large percentage of people do that. And it's also pretty well known that it's quite easy to determine geographic location or where people live in general based on their search queries. Because a lot of people do search queries that are local or indicate where they live. So search queries are by definition not de-identified information. Even if you remove the user ID, your search query itself will give you away. And this was exactly the case of Thelma Arnold. She did search queries on Arnold. She did search queries on 65-year-old single men. She did search queries on what do you do when a dog urinates on your furniture. And she did search queries about properties in her neighborhood in Georgia. So when you put all of these together, you can figure out very quickly that she's female, she's around 65, she's single, she lives in that county in Georgia, and her name is Arnold. So I think looking at the white pages will probably, it's all you really need to do in order to figure out who that person is. So this example of the AOL example is not a compelling example because the search queries were quite identifiable to start off with. And of course it was a very big mistake by AOL to release such identifiable information, release it publicly. In the case of Illinois, the neuroblastoma registry had zip5 codes, 5-digit zip codes in the data set, and therefore that data set would not pass the safe harbor standard, because safe harbor says you should not include zip5s, and under certain conditions you should not even include zip3s. So in that case, the data set that was released would not pass the safe harbor standard that we were using. In the Netflix case, there are a couple of issues there. One is that dates of movie ratings were included, so because it includes dates, it would not pass the safe harbor standard. But also, the people who did the attack on the Netflix data claimed that the data, they cannot believe the data was perturbed in any way. So even the folks who did the attack made it clear they didn't believe this was the identified data. So because they don't believe any perturbation was done to the data. So if anything was done by Netflix, it must have been sufficiently weak that it didn't convince the folks who looked at the data carefully. There are other issues with that attack as well, related to false positive rates that were never validated and so on. But I think the fact that it was not de-identified properly is enough to not put a lot of weight to this attack, in that that the identification that was done was not strong. And finally, in the CBC case, the adverse drug event database that's released by Health Canada includes the date of the report. And if the report is of a death, then you pretty much know the date of death. Again, according to the safe harbor standard, including dates would be prohibited because that reveals a lot of information, which is exactly what happened in this case. Plus, in the federal court case between the CBC and Health Canada, the judge ruled that including even province in this case was too much information because that allowed a re-identification attack. But it wasn't just province. I think if you look, to the extent that information was available about what was done, if having province and having date of death was sufficient to do quite narrow queries on the obituaries to find only a small number of families that matched those criteria. And clearly the CBC was successful in doing that. However, I mean, when I spoke to the CBC, they did say, the producers at the time, they did say that All they have to do is post an ad or an announcement on the radio or on TV, local TV, and say, does anybody know someone who has X or Y or Z happen to them? And they'll get tons of folks calling in, telling on their friends and neighbors. So the argument was they don't actually have to do a re-identification attack themselves because people will generally volunteer that information to them if they ask for it. Nevertheless, from a re-identification attack perspective, the adverse drug event database, as it was released initially, would be very hard to claim that it is de-identified because it included dates and some location information. And I can go through all the other ones, but I won't. The main point is that some of the most often used examples of re-identification attacks were done on data sets that were poorly de-identified. And I think this is the problem that we have, is there's a lot of poorly de-identified data out there that's being released. And figuring out the identity of individuals in this poorly de-identified data is not surprising at all. And this is essentially what we found, is that a lot of these attacks were on poorly de-identified data, and this is why they were successful, but the attacks on properly de-identified data had a very low success rate. And so it's not surprising that the claims that were made about this easy re-identification result were alarming, because they included examples of poorly de-identified data as well as properly de-identified data. When you put all these together, you have such a high hit rate of 26% of your database being re-identified on average. That's an alarming number, but it includes the good ones and the bad ones. When you remove all the bad ones, you end up with a very low hit rate. So I think the main conclusion from all of this is that the evidence doesn't support that claim, at least the evidence that exists today. It's really hard with a straight face to be able to say there's a lot of, to make a strong claim that it's really easy to re-identify data sets that have been properly de-identified, because the evidence is not there. It doesn't mean it has never happened, it doesn't mean it will never happen, but as far as we know today, the evidence is not there. Anecdotally, because we do this work, and we also do re-identification attacks to check for some of the people we work with and to check what we're doing ourselves, it's really hard to re-identify data sets in the real world, because data sets have errors in them. There are data quality issues. You have timing issues. You have a database on that may have some demographic or socioeconomic information that's old, and if you try to use that to match against an existing healthcare database, a registry of some sort, for example, if the timing is not perfect, you may be matching old data with current data, and getting that right is not an easy thing to do. And then verification of matches as well is not a trivial task. If you find that record A in this database matches record B in that database, how do you know if you have the correct match? Normally you would verify the match, and verification is a time-consuming, expensive exercise. So in the CBC example, they apparently found 4 families, and they had to go to all 4 in order to figure out which one was matching. But if you had to do this for thousands of records and verify the matches, it's quite a large and expensive exercise. So you have to be very strongly motivated to do something like this. Okay, so now that I've hopefully convinced you that the evidence is not there, then what you should do is to de-identify data properly. Because what we do know is that if you de-identify data properly, you provide sufficient protection in terms of re-identification. So now I'll talk a little bit about, in a Canadian context, what this sufficient protection means. And I'll take a very simple example. And this is based on analysis we did in Quebec using data from the RAMQ, which is the provincial health insurer. We had data on just under 1 million Montrealers, people living on the island of Montreal, over an 11-year period. And here we're looking at 3 pieces of information: their postal code, their date of birth, and their gender. And the issue there was, well, how can these basic demographics be used to re-identify individuals? So for any year out of the 11 years, the x-axis in this graph shows you the postal code, so the number of characters in your postal code, and the y-axis shows you uniqueness, which is a very crude measure of re-identification risk. But I think it makes the point very, very well. So if we look at the full date of birth, so this is day, month, year, and the full 6-character postal code, we find that on this graph, about 96% or so of the population is unique. If we only look at adults, so if we took all the youth out of this and only looked at adults, about 99% of the population of the island of Montreal is unique. So essentially, your date of birth and 6-character postal code is a unique identifier. I'm comfortable generalizing this to other urban centers across the country because there's similar characteristics in terms of distributions with other urban areas. It doesn't work, it's not as dramatic or alarming for rural areas. It's still quite high for rural areas, but the numbers are a little bit smaller. So let's talk about urban Canadians then. For adult urban Canadians, your date of birth and postal codes are essentially a unique identifier because the vast majority of individuals are unique on these two pieces of information. If you reduce the number of characters in your postal code, say to 3 characters, and you still have the full date of birth, then about 80% of the population is unique. Now, uniqueness is bad because if I know my neighbor's date of birth and postal code, which I do, and if I don't, I can find it from various public registries, then it is, and I find a record that matches in any registry or any database, I'm almost certain it's my neighbor because of this uniqueness characteristic. If you only have the year of birth, so instead of the full date of birth, you only have the year of birth, then the year of birth and the 6-character postal code, about 65–70% or so are unique, which is still quite a large percentage. So the key point here is by reducing the precision, you can reduce the re-identification risk. But you have to be careful because re-identification risk is a function of the combination of variables that you're looking at. So sometimes I talk to, let's say, research ethics boards and say, oh no, we never allow anybody to release more than 3 characters of the postal code. So, okay, so do you allow them to release the full date of birth? Sure, full date of birth is fine, but never more than 3 characters of the postal code. But here you see that 80% of the population would be unique, urban population would be unique on 3-character postal code and the full date of birth. So removing precision from the from the postal code may not actually be reducing the risk sufficiently to claim that it's not identifiable or that the risk is sufficiently low. And the same thing here, say, well, we never let them have date of birth, it's only year, that's the maximum level of detail we will allow for release. But then they allow 6-character postal code. So again, here we have 65% or so of the population is unique on the year of birth and the 6-character postal code. So the risk comes from the combinations of variables, not from a single piece of information, which means that the risk has to be looked at, unless you're releasing exactly the same data over and over again, you'd have to look at the combination of variables or combination of information that is being disclosed each time to decide whether that combination has a high risk or not. And then based on that, decide what you need to do. And you can, when you remove precision to reduce the risk, which is one way to do it, there are other ways, there are trade-offs. So in this example, you can remove precision from postal code and have more information on the year of birth. So if you're dealing with kids, for example, having the exact date of birth or infants, the exact date of birth is important. So in that case, you may want to have exact date of birth, but then remove more geographic information. So you can play around. If you have multiple pieces of information, you can play around with the level of precision in one versus the other to achieve a low level of risk, but also customize the data release to how the data will be used. So again, if you have infants, you need date of birth. You want to give them more information around the date of birth. But if you're going to do some geospatial analysis, then you want to provide more maybe postal code information because that's relevant for the geospatial analysis, but then you reduce precision on the age, for example. So you can do these trade-offs. The other important thing is longitudinal data. So the re-identification risk from longitudinal data is always going to be higher than cross-sectional data. And in this example, we're looking at 1 year versus 3 years worth of data. So 3 years essentially means we have the postal code at the beginning of each year. The RAMQ, the data set they gave us was the known postal code of the individuals at the beginning of each year. It's actually quite surprising how many people move in Montreal every year. We were a large percentage. That 1st of July thing when the whole city moves, It's a large percentage of people who move. Anyway, but when you look at the pattern of movement, it's also quite unique. So very few people lived in one place in year one, another place, that other place in year two, and that third place in year three. If you know the pattern of movement of individuals over time, as in this example, then that also increases the uniqueness or re-identification risk of individuals. But the same can be said for different types of longitudinal data. So if you know that the dates that someone had visited a clinic, for example, then that pattern of visits by date makes it possible or reduces the number of people who would match that criterion. And if people have a large number of visits. So if you look at, for example, visits in hospitals, you'll see a very large peak at people who visit once or twice a year, and then a very long tail where people have a very large number of visits over the year, in the tens or maybe even in the hundreds. And so even the number of visits over a period of time becomes potentially a piece of information that can be used for identification. If you have one person who came to the hospital 100 times last year, that person really does stand out. The pattern of visits also has implications because for certain types of treatments, let's say if you're a dialysis patient and you're coming in, that pattern is very consistent and it repeats at regular intervals and is very recognizable. So there are various tricks that one can use to re-identify individuals from longitudinal data, and you just have to be careful with longitudinal data to think through of these different patterns that can be used and deal with them. So in terms of an overall de-identification process, this is the process we've essentially been using for the last few years, and it has three main steps. The first step is to set your threshold, which essentially defines the acceptable risk. So let's say I'm a registry, I'm going to release data to a researcher. I need first of all to decide how much risk I'm going to take. And there's a whole process for deciding on that risk. And the risk will not be the same for all data sets, and it will not be the same for all people you give data to. So if I'm giving data to an entity that is a fortress and has very strong processes, security and privacy processes for protecting the data, then the risk in that transaction is much lower than if I'm giving a data set to a researcher who runs a small lab and doesn't have any infrastructure support and very few practices to handle sensitive information. So that second case, the risk will be much higher. The risk in that transaction is much higher, and I will use a different threshold then, because the chances of a breach in the second case is much higher than chances of a breach in the first case. And this is really what we're getting to. You're trying to somehow quantify or capture what are the chances of a breach occurring. So for example, in academic institutions, you have students who come and go, and I've seen cases where overseas students would be walking off back to their home countries with databases of patient information because the lab that was running the project didn't have strong controls in place. So the probability or the chances of a breach is one factor, but also another factor, of course, is the sensitivity of the data. You would not treat very sensitive, say, mental health information the same way as you would treat some less sensitive condition or common condition. And this is really this has to do with patient trust. You would not treat all conditions equally, and this is a subjective call. But there's some general things we do know that are more stigmatized and that can be used, can cause more harm to patients if they become known, either social harm or financial harm. So you take all these factors into account when you're setting the threshold, basically. Decide what is an acceptable risk of harm to the patients, but also of a breach occurring and so on, and you set what risk am I willing to take when I release this data. And then the second, so I'll give you a link to our website at the end, and you can find more information than you probably ever wanted to know about that, every aspect of this process. And then the second step is to measure the risk. So there are different ways that the risk can be measured from an actual data set, whether it's cross-sectional data or a longitudinal data set. And you also look at the different types of attacks that are plausible on your data set. And it's a very mechanical process. There, depending on the nature of your data, who you're giving it to, there are a series of attacks that you would consider, and just go through the process of seeing whether they're plausible or not, and measure the risk for each one of those attacks. And then you compare that measured risk to your threshold, and if the measured risk is higher than your threshold, then you have to de-identify the data. If the measured risk is below your threshold, then you're done, because you can make a plausible, defensible claim that my actual risk is below what I consider to be acceptable, and therefore this data is considered de-identified. And again, this is the process we've been using for the last few years. It's worked very well, and a number of large registries in Canada and the US have been using this to release data, and it's a kind of a very logical, rational risk management type process. If the risk is high, then you transform the data, and there are many ways to transform data. It'll be a function, of course, of the nature of the data. You do different for longitudinal data versus cross-sectional data, or if you have free-form text versus structured data in a database. But reducing precision is one technique, so you'd reduce the precision of the postal code, or you can do more sophisticated analysis on geographic information to reduce the risk. You can subsample. So a lot of data analysts really don't like subsampling, but from a re-identification perspective, it's a very powerful approach. Essentially, instead of releasing the 100% of your data, you can release a 70 or 50 or 40% of the data set, and that reduces your re-identification risk substantially. It's a very powerful technique, simple and powerful technique to reduce risk, and I think should be considered when the full data set is not required. And for most statistical analysis, I mean, if you look at statistical power, generally speaking, for most tests, for small effect sizes, a data set of about 2,000, 2,500 records will give you essentially full power, right? Like 80, 90% power. So anything above 2,500 records, you cannot make the statistical power argument to say we need more data. Anyway, subsampling is one approach, and then suppression is another approach, which means you remove records or you remove values in your database. So, for example, we work with the birth registry in Ontario, and if you have a 50-year-old mother, that's unusual, and therefore we would suppress the age for that particular record so that it's not known what the age of that mother was, but then still release the rest of the record, for example. So you can strategically suppress values in your database to ensure the risk is acceptable or below your threshold. And in practice, we haven't had data utility problems, in the sense that we haven't had data users come back to us and say, you've given me a completely useless data set. In all cases, I think we've been able to satisfy the data users, and we went back and asked them, was this okay? We always got a yes answer. Yeah, this was okay. I managed to do what I needed to do, and it really was not a problem. So I think in practice, by using a different set of techniques and negotiating with the data user a little bit to understand what their needs are, what analysis they want to do, and customizing the de-identification for their needs to give them maximum data for what they want to do, and essentially calibrating the de-identification to their requirements, you can produce data sets that have a high utility to the end user. And the process is iterative as well, so you may transform the data, go back to the data user and say, here's what we can offer you. The data user may say, not good enough, let's try a couple of other things. Either change the threshold or change the data request. So in terms of the thresholds, we settled on 4 values, and these are essentially, you can think of them as probabilities or percentage of records at risk. But we use those 4 values because they're defensible. There's a large amount of precedent for these 4 levels of risk in terms of, we didn't start releasing data today. We've been releasing data for 20, 25 years. The national statistical agencies have been releasing census data for many years. There's a large body of literature on acceptable risk levels, public release of data, and so on. So there are a very large number of precedents. When we looked at those precedents, we looked at the policies of ministries of health and national statistical offices and large data custodians here in the US. We came up with those four numbers, essentially what everybody was using. So you'd use a 0.33 risk for highly trusted transactions when you're releasing data to a trusted party that will sign a data sharing agreement, which includes a clause prohibiting re-identification, and they have good practices in place. And at the other extreme is 0.05, which is essentially your public data release. And we've been involved in some public data releases as well. For example, the Heritage Health Prize, which is a large competition that was based on data from an HMO in California with a $3 million cash prize at the end for whoever builds the best model to predict hospitalization in the next year. We used the 0.05 threshold for that. Again, in the U.S. Centers for Medicare and Medicaid, they released a public claims data set. They used the 0.1 threshold, and you can go and download that data set now. So that was a public release with 0.1, which is a bit higher than what we normally use, but again, CMS has set a precedent by releasing data at that level of risk. But we would argue then that these are the risk levels that we've been releasing data at for many years. We can argue that this is a level of risk that has been accepted by society thus far anyway for releasing this. Some HIV data is released at a 0.33 threshold in the US, for example. So I think that's a bit high for HIV data just because of the sensitivity of the data, but a lot of precedents across that spectrum. But they always fall into one of those four bins. So then the issue is, what is an acceptable threshold? If you choose one of those and you can justify it, then there's a lot of precedent to support that decision. And you know, these precedents may shift over time as well. But as of today, this is what we have. And these come from, of course, scientific literature, court orders, regulator orders. We looked at the orders of the privacy commissioners across the country to see what thresholds they use. You know, they often use a cell size of 5, for example, sometimes a little bit higher, sometimes cell size of 10. But there are a lot of precedents for the releases of de-identified data using those thresholds. And so the way we've operationalized this in practice is we look at 3 different things, which are highlighted at the top, essentially 3 dimensions of risk. Mitigating controls, which are essentially the security and privacy practices of the data recipient. So if I'm giving you data, I want to evaluate what security and privacy practices you have in place. And if you have good practices, then I'm going to give you a higher threshold. And if you have poor practices, I'm going to give you a lower threshold. We also look at motivation and capacity to re-identify, so which is the second tab. And for example, if you're releasing data to a journalist, chances are they probably will want to write a story about re-identification if they can. If you're giving data to a researcher, chances are, unless you have an agreement, of course, that prohibits re-identification. But given that the 14 attacks I mentioned were mostly done by researchers, you really have to have a prohibition on re-identification in any kind of agreement, and have an agreement and a prohibition in order to ensure that you have a legal protections around that scenario. And then the third dimension is the invasion of privacy test, which looks at the sensitivity of the data, looks at the potential for harm to patients if the data was re-identified, and looks at consent as well. So if there was consent to use the data for secondary purposes, then there's low risk. If the patients don't even know that the data is being used for secondary purposes, then we look at whether notice has been given either to the patients or to a consultation was done with a patient group or patient representative to create awareness that this kind of data release is happening and so on. So you take all of these factors into account, and at the end you come up with one of these 4 values. And we've gone through various validation exercises for the scoring algorithm, and it seems to have a good amount of face validity. But that provides you with a way to set the thresholds. As I mentioned, measurement is a more technical issue, but there's, again, on our website a lot of material on actual measurement. And then for the transformation of data, as I mentioned, there's the 3 things that tend to work very well are reduction in precision, subsampling, and suppression. And so the trick is to somehow balance those 3 things to produce a data set that's still very useful for the end user. And I think that there are ways to do this. I mean, there's been a lot of work on this, and there are good ways to apply these things selectively to maximize data quality. So then in summary, I think that it's still important to continue to de-identify data. When it's done properly, it's a powerful technique to protect the data set and provide a very strong defense. It's very defensible. If you have a good methodology it's a very defensible approach to the patients themselves, to tell them we've exercised due diligence and we're very careful, but also I think to regulators and investigators to say, well, due diligence was exercised, and here's the process that was used to make all these decisions. Because the evidence that we have today shows that if it's de-identified properly, the chances of a successful re-identification attack are low. They're not zero. So if I choose a threshold of 0.1, and someone launches a re-identification attack and is able to re-identify 1% of the records, let's say, then, well, that's within the error margin. We took the risk, and someone launched an attack and they were able to re-identify within our risk error margin. So that would be considered acceptable. That's the risk we took initially. If we don't want that risk, we reduce our threshold to a lower one, and therefore the chances of a successful re-identification attack, or the percentage of records that can be re-identified, would be lower. So it's a conscious decision that you're making up front. What I would say, though, is that re-identification attacks are very difficult to do. So in a lot of this analysis, the thresholds and so on, we're being, I think, quite conservative still. We're still erring on the conservative side, because doing this in practice is not straightforward and requires a lot of skill. And in a lot of the re-identification attacks, the researchers had to develop completely new techniques and methods in order to launch the attack, even on the data that was not de-identified properly. So it requires tremendous skill to launch these re-identification attacks, because they often require inventing new techniques to do so. And then it's important to, as I mentioned before, take into account all the fields and to follow, I think, a good methodology for choosing your acceptable risk. And with that, I will conclude. The next slide has my contact information, and this is our website. So there's a lot more information on our website. We have a knowledge base as well, which we try to keep up to date with examples and so on. We have a mailing list, which we send out information on a regular basis about events, publications, and so on. I strongly encourage you to subscribe to it if you want to remain up to date on the work that, certainly the work we've been doing, but also the work on some of the work that we're involved with, and some of our partners are doing as well. With that, thank you very much for inviting me. You have to